So there are 3 levels at which we need to prevent and control a disease. The first one is local, right? So think about the small scale things that we can do that we experience day to day. There's immunization, herd immunity, right? So and I'll be using COVID-19 as a huge example here. But sorry, so we've got herd immunity. So during COVID-19, you would have heard that term a lot. No pun intended. So you would have heard that term a lot, especially like in Britain, where they were really aiming to like achieve herd immunity. Obviously, it didn't end up working out. But that is something that they aim for. So that's the herd immunity. Then personal hygiene, so things like washing hands, covering coughs, cleaning surface. We've got safe health practices, so like staying home when you are sick, using contraceptives, and finally public health and information. So this is about creating awareness in society. So that's that. Then we've got regional, state, and so on a regional level, we are looking at a state and a country level. What are we doing to stop the spread of the infection? Again, monitoring environmental consider like sanitation facilities, food and water supplies, combating climate. So with things like, for example, again, with malaria, for example, right? A huge issue in Africa, in Southeast Asia, a huge condition that is affecting a lot of people. And so with something like that, like monitoring environmental conditions, like trying to drain out swamps is a big strategy that a lot of these areas apply in order to stop the infection of to stop the spread of malaria, because that is the environment in which mosquitoes thrive, and that and the disease is spreaded. So there's monitoring environmental conditions, improving swift identification, so surveillance, recognition, and diagnosis. This again we saw with COVID-19. There were test areas set up everywhere. There were like specific areas were being surveyed, were being surveyed and surveillanced. Also, like something that they started to do towards the end of not the end, but like towards the end of the pandemic, was when they started to test the sewage water of specific areas in order to identify which buildings or which areas had infections. So that was another thing that they were doing, and generally creating appropriate responses. Global is when we're now looking at generally the biggest scale, and we're firstly looking at quarantine, so isolating, banning individuals from traveling. So as you would know, travel basically shut down in 2020 as a result of this in most countries. Communication is done through reputable sources, like World Health Organization, and monitoring affected and potentially affected individuals, like travel cards, documents used to track this data. For example, if you would see that during the time that there was Ebola in like 2016, it was a huge epidemic at the time, and what they did was they if you traveled to Africa, and you were coming back, they would ask you, and at the airport, anyone who was coming into Australia, they would be asked whether or not you traveled to Africa like in the past week or something. I can't remember how long it was, but it definitely they would definitely ask you whether or not you've traveled to that part of the world, because of the fact that you may potentially be carrying the disease. Prevention and control. Obviously, hygiene practices play a huge role. Quarantining, vaccination, public health programs, pesticides, and genetic engineering. So genetic engineering, novel, engineering resistance to pathogens like plants, animals, vectors, humans. You would see that there has been some scientific research and development surrounding having mosquitoes, engineering mosquitoes that don't have that can not have, or rather that are resistant to the Plasmodium protozoa, and they have red eyes. There had been some research into it recently. I can't remember when that was, but there was research into it. And there's research generally into stopping mosquitoes from carrying the plasmodium virus. There has been scientific research into that too, so engineering mosquitoes. And gene drive, so push inheritance of modified gene in natural population. So vaccination, attenuated dead, so you can see the graph, attenuated dead or synthetic viral particle introduced to trigger a primary response. So through this, the antibody concentration, as you can see, after the first vaccine, so first vaccine on infection happens here. The primary response, the first time around the whole immune system response happens, we get, this is the antibody concentration, happens over 40 days. Happens over like 20-25 days. The second time that you get it, the response, you can see the slope here is so steep, like the response is rapid, and the antibody concentration is so huge the next time. So vaccines play a huge role in that, and we've seen in the pandemic that again they've played a significant role in reducing the severity of the infections and also preventing infection. Okay, now let's have a look at prevention and control, and now focusing on antibiotics and antivirals. So antibiotics are medications which inhibit bacterial cell processes to stop the growth of the bacteria or kill the pathogen. And what they do is these interfere with cell wall synthesis, they interfere with nucleic acid synthesis, protein synthesis, and cell membrane permeability. And their effectiveness is depends obviously on the antibiotic and also the disease, but we have seen antibiotic resistance become a big issue recently. And the same thing happened with the antibiotics for the for malaria as well. Like people that the pathogen has become resistant to it. So with antibiotic resistance, the development of bacterial strains which do not respond to use of antibiotics, like there is bacterial strains that then adapt to the antibiotic and stop responding to it. That is what happened with malaria, and this arises due to a misuse and overuse of antibiotics. So you would see that if you ever have like a sore throat or a cough or whatever, you would not be given an antibiotic unless it gets like really bad. So that is an example of that. Antivirals, these are medication used to treat viral infections. So remember, based on the viral life cycle, they block entry into the cell, they block viral synthesis by inhibiting transcription, and they block release of viruses. So effectiveness, well, they are difficult to manufacture, molecules which block viruses without disrupting normal cell function. There is rapid viral evolution. There is, of course, antiviral resistance, and these are very expensive. So when we look at prevention and control, we want to think about incidence, prevalence, and mortality, three important terms. So incidence is the frequency of new cases over a specified period of time. So with COVID-19, the incidence was number of new cases every week or every day. Prevalence is the proportion of a particular population affected by a disease. So the prevalence of COVID-19 would be everyone who's had the disease, has had COVID-19 ever since like the beginning of the pandemic, for example. And mortality is the number of deaths within a particular population as a result of it. So COVID-19 mortalities differ worldwide, but we look at COVID-19 mortalities worldwide, globally, we look at it nationally, and also based on like different states as well. Here is some info on the historical sort of onto the historical pathway of looking at infectious diseases and information surrounding infectious diseases. So we start off with Hippocrates, the very, very famous, known as the sort of the god of modern science. So Hippocrates proposes primitive form of epidemiology, noting diseases only occur in certain places because of local conditions, and then that is then obviously developed upon from the 460 BCE all the way to 1965, when the World Health Organization implements the first global epidemiological surveillance unit to predict and track the spread of communicable diseases globally. And this is just this obviously table does not go into a lot of detail. I would definitely recommend for you to research a bit more, but it gives you a good idea of that development over time, and you can definitely add on. There's so much more going on, you can add on to it. Currently, in terms of surveillance, there's event-based surveillance and reporting by healthcare professional, news reports, social media, the Global Public Health Intelligence Network, and they aim to provide real-time data on local disease activity. Web-based, of course, we have got lots of resources online that allow us to track diseases. With Our World in Data, for example, is a really good website that does that. And there was also one that became really famous that was I guess programmed by a high school student that showed the worldwide statistics for COVID-19. Modeling is used to predict how infectious diseases may spread. We saw a lot of this in COVID-19 where they actually showed models on what would happen if vaccinations weren't rolled out in a way, or what would happen if masks weren't made mandatory. So we've seen a lot of that. Looking now at bush medicine. So bush medicine considers traditional skills and practices which were used by the Indigenous Australians to maintain their level of health, and they use native flora and fauna and also preventative and diagnostic treatments in order to treat diseases, and they also focused on the treatment of mental illnesses. So considering a holistic view of health is important, and appreciating the cultural knowledge and traditional knowledge systems that have existed long before modern medicine has come in is also very important. So national Aboriginal health strategy is not just physical well-being of the individual. So they have outlined that not just the physical well-being of the individual, but the social, emotional, and cultural well-being of the whole community. This is the whole of life view, and it also includes the cyclical concept of life, death, life. Indigenous Australian communities are diverse and distinct, which means that bush medicine is a collective term, but there's no single set of Aboriginal medicines and remedies. It is a huge collection of remedies and treatments. So finally, prevention and control, looking at firstly a patent, and patent is being used. Patents are obviously used, when, for example, the vaccine formula and stuff that has been patented. Different companies have patented their different, molecule, or like the different processes. But generally, your patent is a legally enforceable right for a device, substance, method, or process. So IP Australia. And why do we have them? Because it means exclusivity, and so your intellectual property cannot be copied. And so IP and Indigenous culture, how does that play into bush medicine and Indigenous medicine, as we've talked about? IP rights, they give people the right to use their property as they choose. The good thing here is that it's helping people to profit from the ideas. If someone else uses your idea, they have to pay you for it. Bad is that it leads to a creation of monopolies and increasing price of important creations. So this happens a lot in the pharmaceutical industry, where they patent specific drugs and antivirals and stuff, and they make money from that patent because no one else can produce that. Only they can produce, those popular drugs. And there was even an example of a specific drug that was patented by a big big pharma company, and really successful. And what happened is, after its patent expired, I think after like 4 years, they changed a molecule or something in the drug and then applied for a patent again, and they got it, and they made lots of money from it. So it's a huge thing. And when we talk about patent, it does not necessarily align with the Indigenous concept of ownership. So the chain of connection isn't acknowledged. Indigenous Australians have nurtured and protected flora and fauna for 65,000 plus years, and so it is an important contribution that they have given to science and medicine. A case study is the smoke bush in Western Australia. It is traditionally used and nurtured by Indigenous Australians for medicine. The US Department of Health and Human Services filed for a patent for its exclusive rights over active molecule in smoke bush. However, and that means that they actually got that patent. So the US government, the Western Australian government, and also a pharmaceutical company, they all profit from this patent, but the traditional owners who have used it and nurtured it do not get any recognition.